Now I'm going to introduce our resource speaker. Henry Emery is the Managing Director of Latitude Aviation English Services. He's a specialist provider of aviation language training and testing services with a distinguished career dedicated to advancing aviation communication. Emery has been instrumental in developing innovative training programs and assessments that address the linguistic needs of aviation professionals worldwide. He is the co-author of the British Council Award-winning Aviation English, Macmillan 2008, and Check Your Aviation English, Macmillan 2010, which have become key resources for aviation English education. Emery also served as the project manager of for the English test for aviation, the first ever language test endorsed by the International Civil Aviation Organization. His further or his expertise contributed further to the development of the second edition of the ICAO or ICAO Rated Speech Samples Training Aid, or the RSSTA, which is a vital resource for training and benchmarking aviation English proficiency. In addition to his leadership at Latitude, Emery is a board member of the International Civil Aviation English Association, where he collaborates with global stakeholders to enhance language standards and support safer aviation operations. His pioneering contributions to aviation English have earned him recognition as a thought leader in the field, with a legacy for work that continues to shape the future of aviation English. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present to you, and let's give him a warm round of applause, Henry Emery.
Wow, Ramsey, thank you so much for that introduction. You make me sound much better than I am. I really appreciate that, and thank you so much for the invitation to kick off this third season. What an honor for me um, to take the floor with you on the ILAS talks. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen now. Please tell me when you can see the first page. Excellent, the first slide. So we're talking today about assessing listening comprehension, which is a very exciting topic, really exciting. Listening's a very fascinating skill. I think for me, the most fascinating of all, for all sorts of reasons. It's the most used skill, they say. Listening comprehension of all the four macro skills is the one we employ the most. So it's very important in a very broad sense, but of course it's exceptionally important for air-ground communications, for pilots and for air traffic controllers. So it's great for me to kick off this season talking about such an important and such an interesting skill. We're going to cover a lot of ground. There's so much I wanted to talk about that the problem was working out what to leave out. That was the difficulty when preparing for this talk. So I'm going to try and be ambitious with the ground we cover. But as a result of that, it means we can only really give a light touch to the subject matter. So rather than taking a deep dive into one aspect of assessing listening comprehension, instead we're going to take a very light touch across a range of subtopics. And I'm bringing to this presentation my experience as a practitioner. So I'm not an academic. I'm not a pilot or an air traffic controller. I'm not a researcher. Instead, I call myself a practitioner. That is a person who creates training and assessment tools and helps to implement them. So very much thinking about this in terms of practice, the practice of training and assessment. That said, I am going to refer a little bit to the literature. And as always, when I do, the content of this presentation will be an assembly of other people's ideas. So I don't claim ownership of anything you are going to see. Rather, it's an assembly of great ideas that I've seen over the years in this space. So let's have a look at what we will cover then. We'll kick off with looking at the construct of listening comprehension. What is it and how does it work? And then we'll move on to looking at some real world listening tasks. And we'll tease out the difference between really two key listening tasks, which will inform our thinking on the assessment of listening comprehension as we go into point 3, which is looking at texts and looking at tasks and items, again, in a very light touch way. And then at the end, we'll have a little look at reliability, because this is a very important feature of any assessment. So that's the structure of the talk. Let's get stuck in. So on the construct, listening is a highly complex process. What makes it so complex is that the product of listening is just a mental picture in the mind of the listener. That means that we cannot observe listening comprehension. We can't see it. It's just something which happens inside the brain. Some other things about listening are that as listeners, our understanding is always partial. What one person understands from something will inevitably vary from what other people understand of the same thing. So we always have a partial view as listeners. And that ties in with the uniqueness of listening as well. What we understand is unique to us as listeners. Also with listening, it's very fleeting. It happens in real time and it happens in the moment, and it doesn't last long. Lots of research shows that after listening to something, we forget so quickly most of what we heard. And the things which end up in our long-term memory are only a fraction of what we hear. So it's a very fleeting, momentary process. And like I mentioned earlier, it's completely invisible. There is no product of listening comprehension other than what happens in the mind. So it's very, very complex, very difficult to see. Let's have a look at one framework. This one I particularly like. There are several frameworks for the assessment of listening comprehension. This one I particularly like, from Field in 2013. So listening starts clearly with a speech signal. So we have sound which goes in, and our brain identifies those sounds. And this results in a lexical search, where we turn those sounds into words. And then with those words, we parse. So we turn the words into an abstract proposition. And these processes are what Field calls lower level listening processes. Then once we have parsed, we've got our words, we've got our input, and we've parsed this together into a proposition, we then start to build meaning. We might infer, otherwise known as reading between the lines. We look at reference, understanding what things refer to, what we've heard before and what we are hearing now. And we might identify the speaker's intention and context. So we start creating meaning. And then from that meaning, we will create our discourse, which involves structure building, that is organizing and prioritizing what we hear, self-monitoring, so checking we've understood, making sure that we are on the right page, selecting what's important and what's not. So lots of what we hear, we discard immediately because it's not important. So our brain does this selecting for us automatically. And then integrating what we decide is important into a mental picture. And meaning construction and discourse construction are what Field calls higher level processes. Now, these lower and higher level processes occur simultaneously, and they occur in real time. They are automatic processes. They're happening as I speak to you. Putting this into the context of air-ground communications, we need to remind ourselves that the sole object of the language proficiency requirements is aeronautical radio telephony communications. So let's put Field's framework into context. So the controller makes a transmission. Latitude 253, expect 10-minute delay. That traffic is still on the runway. So the first thing the pilot will do is hear those sounds. They come through as phonemes into the ear of the pilot through the headset. And then the pilot will search for lexis from those sounds. The next step will be to pass that lexis together into the transmission. So here we've got the emergence of this abstract proposition. Then we go up into the higher level skills, and here we're constructing meaning. And the pilot may think, she's telling us our approach will be delayed. So identifying the speaker's intention and context. And then maybe reading between the lines. Ooh, the controller sounds a bit frustrated. And then making reference to things we've heard before. So she's talking about the same aircraft she mentioned before. Clearly, this aircraft has been on the runway for some time. So we've got that reference in time. And then we are building discourse. We're organizing and prioritizing. And so here the pilot is selecting what's important. Never mind what's happening on the ground. I'm not concerned about the aircraft on the runway. Now the pilot is thinking, what does 10 minutes mean for us? And then we are integrating that information into our mental model. We're already 15 minutes behind schedule. And all of these processes, lower and higher level processes, will result in quite often a very simple transmission. Roger, latitude 253. So we can see here lots of things happening inside the brain when we are listening. So building on Field's model there, we can also derive some of our listening comprehension construct from the policy itself, in this case, our well-known ICAO rating scale. So if we look at the comprehension criterion, we can see that there are features of these descriptors which we might consider building into our assessments. So we've got linguistic and cultural subtleties at level 6. At level 5, we've got a range of speech varieties. At level 4, we've got common, concrete, and work-related topics. And again, at level 4, we've got an unexpected turn of events. And at level 3, a linguistic or situational complication. So we can see here that there are features of the rating scale that we need to define carefully and elaborate on so that we can write a specification for a listening comprehension assessment. Taking one of these as an example, cultural subtleties at level 6, let's have a look at what this might mean. So here we've got a sequence of aircraft on an approach, and here we've got a pilot making a call, and the pilot might call request slower speed. So here the pilot might be in a landing configuration, which means that the aircraft is restricted as to the speed which it can fly. So the pilot calls and requests slower speed, and the controller says, not unless you want to get to the back of the pack. Now, this was a US, an American controller, and this was a real world transmission. And we can see here the language back of the pack being very cultural. We might conclude that this refers to perhaps a pack of wolves, for example, which would be a very North American cultural reference. So we can see here how culture does creep into radio communications, rightly or wrongly. And therefore, we need to consider as test developers how we weave that into our specification and into our assessment content. At level 5, document 9835 provides us with further guidance on the content of our listening tests. So here from document 9835, level 5 users are not hindered by the less well-structured messages that are associated with unexpected or stressful events. So here we're thinking about less well-structured messages appearing in our listening test content. Now I'm going to play you a real-world transmission here. I hope the sound works. We did test this earlier, so fingers crossed, but you also have the transcription here as well. So here we go. Hopefully you heard that. The quality of the audio is not very good, but in any case, we have the language on the screen. And what's interesting here is that this British pilot of an EasyJet aircraft says, I know you won't have much information yet, but do you know how long before the KLM is expected to land? So this is a very complex transmission, which we could reduce to a very simple question. When do you expect the KLM to land? So real world communications do have complexity. They do feature lots of less well-structured messages. So if we are assessing at level 5, we need to make sure that we are including this feature of real world communication in our test content. Going back up to level 6, 9835 tells us that level 6 users have the ability to discern a meaning which is not made obvious or explicit. So here we're going back to reading between the lines or inference. So let's have a look at what this might mean with some examples. Here we've got 2 pilots on the flight deck and they're talking to each other. And one pilot says to the other, they'll probably change runways after this arrival. So from this, we might infer that the pilot means that the wind usually changes direction mid-morning. That's what the pilot is expecting. Slight change in grammatical structure. They're going to change runways after this arrival. Slight difference in inference. They said it on the radio a few minutes ago. So here we can infer something different from the language used. Looking at this from a controller's perspective, let's imagine we have two controllers in the ops room, and one controller says to the other, Buzz Air 233 will be late. And we might infer that the controller believes that Buzz Air is never on time. He'll be late because he's always late. If we switch that language up a little, Buzz Air 233 is going to be late, and we might infer from this that they had to reroute, so they are going to be late, making a prediction based on solid information. So this level of inference really is something we want to be getting into our content and into our items, so we can move into assessing those higher level language skills. As Gary Buck said back in 2001, good listening tests will generally include inference items. It takes time and trouble to make them, but they are too important to exclude. So some very wise words there from a very important scholar in this area. Angela Garcia in Brazil, working with the ANAC, the regulator in Brazil, has been doing some fabulous postgraduate work in listening comprehension. And I'm going to pull out some of her ideas from a paper she wrote in 2020 with her colleague Fox. She interviewed well over 100 pilots and asked them what they thought was important in pilots' listening comprehension. And here are some of those aspects of listening comprehension. So recognizing words and numbers, being able to understand both phraseology and plain English. So while the policy tells us to look at plain language, plain English only, pilots themselves believe that phraseology is as important, and I would obviously concur with that. Understanding short and longer transmissions and understanding different rates of delivery. Understanding transmissions in spite of background noise, at times of high workload, in congested frequencies, and transmissions which are different from expected. So here we can see from this research, we can elaborate more fully on the features of discourse that we need to get into our assessments. Let's move on now to talking about real world listening tasks. So what we do with listening in real life. Collaborative listening, so listening where we are participants in communication. This is an important concept. Let's have a look at some examples. Here we are. So a conversation. This is clearly very collaborative. You collaborate and co-construct with the person or people you're talking to. Likewise, a telephone call, a business meeting, a job interview are all very collaborative, real-world listening tasks. And then on the other hand, we have non-collaborative listening tasks, and these might include listening to an announcement at the airport, listening to a podcast, listening to a university lecture, or listening to someone else's conversation, otherwise known as eavesdropping. Clearly, in this situation, you do not collaborate. Instead, you are listening as a non-participant. So this distinction between collaborative and non-collaborative listening is quite an important one. And here I'm going to give you a quick task. Here are some real-world listening tasks in the aviation domain. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds, 40 seconds to look at these tasks and decide in your minds. You don't need to say anything or talk together, but just decide in your minds, are these collaborative or non-collaborative tasks? So again, 30 seconds. Are these tasks collaborative or non-collaborative? Okay, hopefully you've had a moment to think about those. Let's run through them together. Passengers listening to a cabin PA address, non-collaborative. It comes over the PA. The passengers cannot interact with the person on the PA, the pilot or the member of cabin crew. So non-collaborative. Pilot communicating with approach control, collaborative. An ATCO talking to a shift supervisor, collaborative. ATCOs listening to a recorded MET briefing would be non-collaborative. A pilot listening to an ATIS broadcast, non-collaborative. A dispatcher talking to a pilot, collaborative. Pilots talking on the flight deck, collaborative. A pilot monitoring the radio frequency in flight, non-collaborative with a question mark. Largely, this task is non-collaborative, unless, of course, the pilot hears her call sign, in which case it quickly turns into collaborative listening comprehension. Okay, so we've identified the distinction between collaborative and non-collaborative listening. Looking back at the rating scale, at level 4, we see this very famous descriptor, clarification strategies. So clearly ICAO were thinking that clarification strategies are part of the listening comprehension construct. And absolutely, I would agree with that. Our ability to manage misunderstanding, either our own misunderstanding or that of our interlocutor, is really important. But this descriptor has possibly shaped test design inadvertently in negative ways, in that it's led many language tests to incorporate the assessment of listening comprehension exclusively in speaking tasks. Now, this is problematic. Let's explore why. Firstly, we have protocol. So the pilot calls control latitude 316. We have a flat problem. We'd like to take up the hold. And the controller responds according to standard phraseology and procedures. Latitude 316, proceed direct Merin, take up the hold is published. Is the controller's response appropriate? Yes, absolutely appropriate. Did the controller understand that the pilot would like to hold? Yes. Did the controller understand that the pilot had a flap problem? We don't know, because what the controller says doesn't shed light on the mental picture that the controller has built. So protocol can mask level of comprehension. Here is another for you. This comes from a mock language test. So the interlocutor says, what's it like to work for Latitude Airways? And the pilot says, well, living in England is okay. What's the pilot doing? Is the pilot taking a pragmatic position on the question, and that she doesn't want to talk about Latitude Airways? or did she not understand the question? Again, what is said masks what is understood. Here is another example for you, again from a mock language test. Our two questions: is the candidate's response grammatically accurate? No. Or at least inappropriate to the question. And that leads us to think, well, did the candidate understand the question? And again, due to possible problems with spoken language proficiency, we don't know. And this is how the assessment of listening comprehension through speaking tasks can lead to muddied measurement. I've got two more examples for you I want to share briefly. These come from the ICAO Rated Speech Samples Training Aid. And this really shows in real life, in a very practical sense, how assessment of listening through speaking activities or tasks can lead to muddied measurement. So I'm going to press play on this so you can hear what the candidate says. Here we are.
The forecast says we'll have freezing rain. We can expect hazardous ramp conditions.
This is a controller. I think he's talking to pilots. That he's telling them that there's freezing rain coming, and he can put it on meter if he wants to.
So some questions for you then. Oh.
We can expect hazardous ramp conditions.
This is a controller. I think he's talking to pilots. That he's telling them that there's freezing rain coming, and he can put it on meter if he wants to.
So here in this task, to answer our question, we don't know if the candidate understood that the ramp conditions might be hazardous, because what the candidate chose to say did not capture the input that the candidate received. So this is a problematic task, certainly with respect to the assessment of listening. Here is another example from, again, from the Rated Speech Samples Training Aid.
From two different aircraft? Yes. Can you compare those two aircraft?
In a single engine piston, the aircraft available 4 people. We have a small engine, the TB-20 kind of aircraft. The autonomy is for 4 hours. We can do some flights, have the essential equipment. I've had 220 brake horsepower. And going to this aircraft.
Did the candidate compare two aircraft? No. Did the candidate understand the question? We don't know. Instead of comparing two aircraft, the candidate chose to describe one aircraft. So can we really make a judgment about the extent to which the candidate understood the interlocutor's prompts? And in this case, we cannot make a judgment. We don't know what happened in the mind of the candidate. So this is a problematic task, again, with respect to the assessment of listening comprehension. So assessing listening through speaking is problematic. So coming back, bringing all of this together, we have the mind of the listener, and we have the input, that's the sound, and this results in an unobservable picture, which triggers lower and higher level processing. It creates a partial temporary picture, and what is understood is very much affected by what you hear and your purpose for listening, otherwise known as the text and the task. So that's listening, totally separate set of cognitive processes. And then from that, we may get a spoken response, which will be contingent on pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, and fluency, but will also be greatly affected by other features of language use and language behavior. For example, the candidate's strategic competence, or rather the speaker's strategic competence, their pragmatics, or the choices that they make about what they say, the protocols governing the communication situation. In our case, air-ground communication has a lot of protocol around it. Sociolinguistic factors, cultural factors, affective schemata, so how the speaker feels, and finally, the requirements of the task, real world or assessment task. So we can see that speaking is something completely different to listening. Yes, they are closely related, but they are separate skills. What does the ICAO guidance tell us? Well, 9835 tells us that a separate listening test can provide information about comprehension independent of a person's ability to interact. And the more recently published document 10197 tells us that test instruments need to contain tasks dedicated to assessing listening comprehension, which are separate from tasks designed to assess speaking performance. This is really very useful guidance. So what does this mean for the design of listening comprehension tests? Well, it means on one hand, we need a text. And by text, I mean the input, which is typically written before it is then recorded. Even though it becomes an audio file, we can still call it a text. It just happens to be a recorded text. So we have our text, and then on the other hand, we have our questions or our task or our items together, which allow us to tap into the content which is contained in the text. Now, the text and the items are very, very closely linked. They work together, they interact together in many different ways. But one very important aspect of the way texts and tasks work together is around the control of difficulty of language tests. We can create a very challenging text and yet write very easy items. Likewise, we can create a medium difficulty text, and we can write very challenging items, or medium difficulty items. So we can control task difficulty through the interaction between the text and the items themselves. Let's talk a little bit about difficulty. Firstly, going back to document 10197, criterion 3, which deals with listening comprehension, let's look at the task first. Sorry, the text first. So the guidance says that we should use recordings that are not publicly available, recordings that are of sufficient length and variety and allow for topics and ideas and events to develop. And texts should have we should have a sufficient range and breadth in the complexity of recordings to enable measurement across the range of levels the test claims to assess. So this is really looking at difficulty. If we've got levels 3, 4, and 5 that we are aiming to assess, then our texts and our tasks need to cover those levels of difficulty. In terms of the text, these need to be written to specification with English language and subject matter experts working in collaboration. And we need to consider the authenticity of the text. So here we're thinking of traffic environment, the discourse, phraseology, and plain language. We're thinking about the length of the text, so ideas and events can develop. And this is really very important because in real world communications, events might occur over 15, 20, 30, 45 minutes. Clearly, we can't do that in a test of listening comprehension, but we do need our narratives to unfold, to create a story in radio communications. So we need to weave those stories into our texts. In terms of difficulty, there are linguistic characteristics which we can control when we record. For example, a faster rate of speech, the extent of pausing, or, well, clearly with the case of radio communications, there is no overlapping speech. Familiarity of accents and pronunciation, intonation patterns, lower frequency vocabulary, complexity of grammar, embedded or not linear clauses or idea units, so more complex transmissions with embedded clauses, and complex pronoun referencing. And of course, many of these things occur in real world communication. These things we can control for text difficulty. Other factors to consider are the extent to which ideas are explicitly stated or whether they require inference, the degree of redundancy. If there is less redundancy, the text becomes more challenging. So redundancy might be repetition of ideas. Text difficulty in terms of organization, the number of speakers can add challenge. A non-linear structure, which is very true of radio communications. We'll hear from one aircraft and then we will hear nothing, maybe for 5 minutes before we come back to that aircraft. So that very non-linear structure of radio communications is apparent. Examples followed by main points, and this may also creep into radio communication. We may get a pilot declaring a problem without understanding what the problem is, for example. So all of these things can be controlled in our texts. And finally, the last set of bullets on the text, less familiar topics will make it more challenging. More ideas, so more content to be distinguished, adds challenge. More important ideas, which are less easy to distinguish from less important ideas, make text more challenging. And changing rather than fixed relationships. And this is quite interesting with pilot-controller communications, when relationships may become tense, or they may break down a little bit through the environment in which pilots and controllers work. So we can add those relationship factors again into our texts too. In terms of items, two key item types to consider are firstly constructed responses, where a test taker will produce language in response to an item. And this might be a short answer, or it might be the completion of a sentence, or it might be a gap fill, or a form or table completion. Constructed responses are relatively easy to create, but it does require language production. which can interfere with the measurement of listening comprehension. Again, short answers can be verbal or written. In either case, as we have seen, we can be prone to muddied measurement where we are asking test takers to produce language in response to comprehension items. So my recommendation, as far as we can, is to go for selected response items. And these might include all sorts of item types that I'm sure you're familiar with: true, false, not given, multiple choice, underlining the correct information, annotating a picture or diagram, ordering or sequencing things, matching numbers with pictures or matching events with recordings. Where we have selected responses, it means the candidate is freer to listen and think less about their response and focus more on the listening comprehension processes, because they are simply choosing between options rather than producing language in response to items. So again, selected response items where we can tend to work better. Task items should be of the same type. So if we are writing a listening task and we are choosing underline the correct information as an item type, stick to the same item type for the task. So rather than mixing up our item types, stick with the same item type. That doesn't mean we need all tasks with the same item type, but it does mean that in individual tasks, we need to stick to the same item type for that task. We need enough items, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we need to make sure we're asking enough questions. The items clearly need to be challenging and impossible to guess from a technical perspective. So it should require close listening in order to answer the question, rather than being able to guess the answer from the way the item has been written. Items need to engage meaning rather than word recognition skills, and they need to engage language rather than technical knowledge. We need to target information which is spaced evenly throughout the text, so that candidates have the opportunity to process the items and process the text as it is being played. And to target content which is located at the end of the text to make sure that the candidate listens from the beginning right until the very end. So there's some broad principles on item writing. Again, this is very light touch, but I hope these principles will be of use to you, allow you to unpack them after this talk and to learn a little bit more. More difficult items will contain few words from the text, so there's little lexical overlap. More difficult items will tap information that is not repeated in the text, that will come after a lot of text, leaving the test taker listening really closely to lots of language before the important information comes, and will tap information which appears in the middle of the text as well. So again, spreading out those items across the text from beginning to the middle and to the end. So lots of ways of controlling item difficulty. Also, the rhetorical structure, where it's problem solution, this is going to make the text more challenging. Now, this is very important for air-ground communication, because this is what pilots and controllers do. When we move into negotiation and more spontaneous use of language on the radio, it is often around some sort of problem or deviation from the routine which requires a solution. So if we can, moving from problems into solutions within our text and items adds challenge and brings an element of the real world into our listening comprehension tests. So back again to document 10197, some very useful guidance here. Presentation of items before the recording is played. This is so important. Make sure that our test takers know what they are listening for before they listen. And then as they are listening, we are looking for synchronized presentation of items and content, which may involve including pauses in longer recordings, or may involve ensuring that there are sufficient intervals between items. Now, a key piece of advice as a practitioner in the design of listening tests is this. Keep this in mind. Task before text. Always present the questions or the items to the candidate before they hear the text. This is absolutely essential. Keep this rule in mind. Task before text. This will enable you to move towards much closer and accurate measurement of the listening comprehension ability. Okay, we're getting closer to the end of the talk now. A few moments on reliability. This is very important when we're dealing with separate tests of listening comprehension, as well as reliability in the measurement of spoken language proficiency. And our questions here are, does the test produce consistent scores? Do parallel versions produce the same score when administered on the same candidate? Does the test discriminate between candidates of differing ability? So will our test scores allow us to see the difference between a weak level 3, a strong level 3, a level 4, a strong level 4? Do the scores enable that granular distinction between different levels of ability? Why is reliability important? Well, it is a very high priority for us as assessors of language proficiency. It is a necessary condition for validity, in that a test cannot be valid if it is not reliable. On the other hand, a reliable test can easily be invalid. So we've got to have in place really good measures of reliability of our listening tests. For this second bullet, a reliable test can easily be invalid. Let's imagine that we give to a pilot or a controller a test of listening comprehension where the speakers are in a podcast talking about, let's say, an aviation incident. And there's plenty of that on the internet today. The test might give us really reliable measures of listening comprehension, but it's not air-ground communication. So in this sense, we can say a reliable test can easily be invalid for our assessment purpose. So we need to manage reliability quite carefully. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. Let's say we have 112 test takers of varying ability, level 3, level 4, level 5, level 6, and they take 2 different tests. The first test has one recording which is 3 minutes long, against which there are 5 items. The second test has 3 recordings, a total of 12 minutes of text, and it has 15 items. So 2 different tests, same group of test takers, 112 test takers. Here is a key for you. So red is a low ability candidate, yellow is a medium ability candidate, and green is a high ability candidate. Just keep those colors in mind, low, medium, and high. So here are the results of our administration of test 1, which has one recording of 3 minutes and 5 items. So we can see none of the 112 candidates scored 1 out of 5. 6 of the candidates scored 2 out of 5. 11 scored 3 out of 5. 23 candidates scored 4 out of 5. And 71 candidates scored 5 out of 5. So this is what happened in this listening test. We can see here that those 71 candidates who scored 5 out of 5 are all bunched up together. We're not discriminating between the medium, yellow candidates, and the high ability candidates in green. They score the same. So we can't see the difference in ability, and that is because the number of items is too few. So we have poor distribution of candidates. We have poor discrimination of candidates. We can't see the difference between medium and high level. And we have poor reliability. So that's test 1, not doing very well with test 1. Let's have a look now at test 2. So test 2 has 3 recordings, 12 minutes of text in total, and 15 items. And you can see here in the table, the candidates are much more spread out in terms of their range of scores. And the distribution looks a little more like this. We've got the low ability candidates scoring low. The medium ability candidates are scoring in the middle. And the high ability candidates are scoring 12, 13, 14, 15 out of 15. So here the assessment is spreading the candidates out really nicely. Remember, exactly the same candidates, different test, different distribution. So here we've got good distribution, we've got good discrimination, and we've got good reliability. Looking at what this means in terms of analysis, we can look at the frequency of scores on the vertical axis with the ability level of the candidates on the horizontal axis. And there is test 1 with the distribution. And there is test 2 distribution. One measure in classical test theory of reliability is known as the Cronbach's alpha. It's a very common, very widely used measure, or at least it has been historically. And we can see that the reliabilities of these two tests are quite different. The alpha for test 1 is 0.456, so really inadequate measure of reliability. Whereas test 2 has an alpha of 0.892, which is close to very strong in terms of reliability. So we can see here that more text, more items, better distribution, better discrimination, higher reliability. So let's summarize these ideas, and we're getting much closer to the end of this talk now. Longer texts means greater domain representation. So we can get more radio telephony into our tests with longer texts. Longer text also means more items. More items means a wider range of proficiency targeted, a wider range of proficiency targeted means a wider score distribution, and a wider score distribution results in higher reliability. So, ladies and gentlemen, when we're designing our listening texts and our listening tests, longer texts, plenty of items. This will help us get closer to good measures of language proficiency. A quick note on double play and single play, because this is something which has been floating around in aviation language testing for a long time. Many tests have double play written into them, or have an option for the candidate to hear a text again. Let's have a quick look at what this means. Double play generally makes tests easier in terms of the quantity and accuracy of recalled lexical items, propositions. It gives us higher scores. So if you want to make your tests easy, incorporate double play. It also introduces variable listening strategies. So the way we hear the first time and the way we hear a second time involves different mental processes. Is that what we want? I ask you. It reduces test-taking strategies, and it reduces anxiety. It also means if we are double playing that we cannot give so much content to our candidates because there is less time. If you play a 5-minute text twice, that's 10 minutes. So double play reduces the quantity of text, the number of items we can present, and therefore also construct coverage. So there are some real disadvantages to double play. Single play, however, enables presentation of more content. It gives us more items. It gives us the possibility for greater construct coverage. This enhances the psychometric quality of a listening test in that it makes a test more challenging and helps us to discriminate between candidates of different listening abilities. It does, however, provide limited capacity to provide sufficient information about context, and that is a disadvantage. And it can cause anxiety at levels beyond real-world listening contexts. And this introduces some constructor-relevant variance. So that anxiety is not really what we want. A quick look in summary from Buck. He said that speech takes place in real time. The text is heard only once and then it's gone. We cannot go back to a piece of speech and hear it again. Of course, we can ask a speaker to repeat, but strangely, speakers virtually never do. We almost never get the same words, and if we do, the stress and intonation are different. In normal language use, we get just one chance at comprehension, and only one. Very wise words. Some final wise words from Holzknecht and Harding last year. Some TLU domains for high-stakes assessment clearly warrant single play listening because precision is a key feature, such as aviation settings. Although possibilities exist for requesting clarification, read back and hear back sequences, it will often be important to draw inferences about what a listener can do in high-risk scenarios. In such contexts, the greater degree of challenge and higher levels of anxiety associated with single play may be construct relevant as they would model the demands of real-world listening environment. So, ladies and gentlemen, think to yourselves, single play for pilots and controllers. Lots of advantages of single play. Quickly back to the guidance, 9835. If comprehension is assessed through specific listening section with individual items, it should not be done to the detriment of assessing interaction. And 10197 tells us that it's possible for tests to also evaluate comprehension in an interactive context. In such situations, the subjective ratings should be used to support the results of dedicated listening sections. So let's bring this together then. We've got, on one hand, non-collaborative listening tasks, and then on the other, collaborative listening tasks. And we need both in our tests for pilots and controllers. Non-collaborative tasks give us greater construct representation, they enable better measurement, and they give us greater reliability. So separate tests of listening comprehension with texts and items. On the other hand, we can keep our collaborative listening tasks because they enable the assessment of clarification strategies, which are very important. Results can be used to complement non-collaborative tasks in accordance with the rating scale, but we need to take care when we are assessing listening comprehension in collaborative tasks. We need to make sure that we really are assessing listening and not something else. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you all so much for attending and for listening. I really enjoyed putting this talk together, and I've really enjoyed the privilege of speaking with you today. So thank you. The references are there on the screen. I'm happy to make the slides from this presentation available. Ramsey, I'll pass them on to you probably next week, if that's okay. But for now, I think we'll move to our Q&A, and that's enough from me. So again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, that was a fun and interesting discussion from Sir Henry. It was truly essential that we see listening comprehension as a way of promoting safety in aviation communication. But before we dive in our question and answer session, I'd like to share my takeaway point about the topic. So I'd like to pinpoint the cognitive processing framework, which is crucial in radio telephony communication, as it enhances operators or individuals' ability to quickly interpret, process, and respond to messages accurately, reducing misunderstandings and improving overall safety. How about you, Hero?
Yes, I agree with you, Johnny. So, a lot from Batch Kilo has a similar topic of study, which concerns about the listening and comprehension. Well, some of them will be creating a software, to improve that. So I do agree about the ICAO language proficiency, which the person's ability to interact depends on the person's comprehension. So that's for my takeaways, partner.
Thank you, partner. At this choice point, everyone, we are opening the floor for the question and answer session. If you're at the Zoom meeting, you can type your questions directly into the chat box. And for those tuning on our Facebook Live, please submit your questions in the chat box, and our technical team will relay your questions to the Zoom session. Also, we encourage everyone, including our international guests, to ask questions and share ideas with all of us.
All right, to proceed with the Q&A portion, may we call on our moderator for this episode, Ms. Rufa Sipaikana, a faculty member of Aviation Communication Department, Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
All right, thank you. Am I loud and clear?
Yes, ma'am.
So once again, thank you very much, Andy, for a very comprehensive discussion of the listening comprehension, which is applicable in the aviation industry. So for our Q&A portion, I would like to ask all our participants if you have questions that you might want to ask. You can again type it in our chat box, or for those who are viewing our episode today in our Facebook Live, you can also submit your questions, and our technical committee the one to practice your questions. So anyone from our participants who might want to ask questions or anyone? Again, we would like to encourage everyone. I think so many of our participants really enjoy the discussion of Henry.
Group, I think someone's raising his hand.
Oh, okay. I can see Cesar. So yeah, you can open your microphone for your questions, Cesar.
Good day, Sir Emery, and good day to everyone in this call. So here's my question. Based on my experience during our aerodrome simulations in class, trying to simultaneously listen for aircraft information and requests, observing aircraft positions on the aerodrome, and giving commands can sometimes lead to an information overload, causing us to provide the wrong instructions to the wrong aircraft, even though we know in our minds what the correct thing to say is and for whom the message must be addressed to. This also happens when trying to listen to ATIS exercises. I know what the ATIS information is being conveyed while listening, but once I try to make sense of it all, the onslaught of information just ends up as a jumbled mess in my head. So, in line with this, what advice can you give to us in order to better improve our listening and comprehension skills during simulations, and how to regulate the flow of incoming auditory information in order to avoid information overload? That's it for my question.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Henry.
That's a really, really good question. And there is so much in that question to unpack. I'm going to keep it simple in terms of my response. Much of your question there is to do with training. It's about how to train listening comprehension so that the onslaught of information is not an onslaught. It is rapidly processed by the expert brain. And that really is about the development of listening comprehension skills, but it's also very closely related to broader professional training as an air traffic controller or as a pilot. There is an inseparable link between listening comprehension and domain expertise. That research has showed this over and over again. So I would strongly suggest that the overload that students experience as they are learning to control traffic or learning to fly an aircraft is absolutely to do with the growing expertise as training takes place. So it's much more a training question than an assessment question per se. I hope that's okay as an answer.
All right, thank you, Henry. I hope that answers the question of Cesar. So we will now move for another questions from our participants. Anyone who might want to ask, you may raise your hand or you may type your questions in our chat box. Again, Hiro, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm just curious, sir. Since Latitude has worked with companies like Emirates Flight Training, Asian, and Qatar Airways, how does Latitude contribute to their success? Like, what is the most excellent and remarkable review you've received from these companies?
Ooh. That's a nice question. It's a little bit commercial in that it's to do with Latitude's business activities. I guess with a customer like Emirates Flight Training Academy, with whom we've been working for 7 or 8 years, I guess it's a relationship of trust, in that the customer values what we provide and we value our customer and do our best for them. But that would be true of anybody that chooses to work with Latitude. But thank you for the opportunity to talk about the business. We're very lucky to have some excellent customers who are very loyal to us.
All right, thank you, Henry, and thank you, Euro. We have a question in our chat box. So it's a question from Tony. Some complain about tests that lack context materials. Do you agree with this? How can we get prepared for training pilots and air traffic controllers when they have to take this kind of test?
That's a superb question from a really great guy, Tony. Thank you so much for that question. The problem for us as teachers is training pilots and controllers to inappropriate tests. You're absolutely right. Very many aviation language tests include content which is irrelevant to aeronautical communication. And we can criticize the test for that, and possibly the test developer, and possibly the regulator. That doesn't help us as teachers. How do we prepare students to listen to content which is irrelevant to the domain? It's a really good question. I think really, Tony, we have to sit and wait. In time, with content like document 10197, we will see more appropriate listening comprehension content in aviation English tests. For now, you have to do your best by your students, accepting that the best for your student might not be the same as the best for the safety of aeronautical communication.
All right, thank you, Henry. Sir Ramsey, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, for that question, and Henry for responding. Yeah, I think it's a lot of work, Henry, with regard to this question. And just want to share one thing that my students are actually doing here in the Philippines. We have these two groups of students in the aviation communication department that are working on developing, and they actually developed already the contextualized aeronautical English test. And when I say contextualized, it's something that uses the atmosphere, the environment, the contextualized setting in the Philippines, which they are supposed to be like knowing, because we've been having had like a lot of difficulty finding appropriate tests that would really address the needs of the students in terms of getting them more comfortable and getting them more inclined to understanding different, for example, let's say when they talk about airports, okay, most of the tests that we are actually using and I mean, using in our assessments before, like maybe some 5 years ago, Henry, because our program has just been, offered maybe some 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. And we have benchmarked some of the tests actually from your tests, okay, and also from other international tests that are publicly available. So it was kind of hard for us or for our students to get familiar with all of it. Of course, we completely understand that we also provide, or we produce also globally competitive students when they want to work abroad, but most of our students are working in the Philippines or going to work in the Philippines. So I think it's a must that they should be engaged more contextually, okay, contextually dependent. So I think I really understood where Tony is coming from. That a lot of people are complaining about the lack of context in the material, and I think the 10197 document has provided or emphasized authenticity and context in terms of creating a test. So far in the Philippines, we have developed two. This is in the context of academe. Because the Civil Aviation Authority of the Philippines has a different test, although we have some tests that we have acquired for research purposes, but the ones that our students are doing are the ones that were developed, and we're trying to see maybe in a year or two how this would impact their listening comprehension, since we have also tried to touch upon vocabulary structure and also comprehension. These, three particularly. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sir Ramsey, for sharing that. So we have another question from Anna in our chat box. Henry, it was a great pleasure listening to your talk. I always learn so much from you. I noticed in your talk that cultural sublitis level 6 comprehension ICAO rating 2 were not included as part of the text difficulties to be included in tasks. How do you see that these elements could be included in listening only tasks, since we can never predict exactly what expressions and idioms the native speakers, pilot, or air traffic controllers will be included?
It's a really good question. And Anna Lugia, it's lovely to have an opportunity to interact with you again. It's great to see you, and thank you for your question. I think your question is quite well aligned with any aspect of the content which we weave into a text, whether it's the idiomatic language that more expert and particularly native speakers deploy on the radio, or whether it's the grammatical structures or the pragmatic features of language that we see in radio communications. We as test developers need to make principled decisions. So we need to write a specification for our listening texts, and we need to adhere to that specification as we operationalize the construct within the content. What does this really mean, this language that I'm saying? It means that we need to choose content which represents what happens in the real world. Yes, we can never predict exactly the expressions, the idioms that higher level users, particularly native speakers, will use. That is unpredictable. That is language proficiency. But what we can do is build in some of that unpredictability into our content so that we provide sufficient challenge for the higher ability listeners amongst our test taker population.
All right, thank you, Henry, for answering that question. We still have more questions from our participants in our Zoom and also in our Facebook Live. Again, any more questions? Going once, going twice. I think we don't have any more questions. So once again, thank you very much, Henry. I will now give back our floor to our host. And once again, thank you for your discussion, a comprehensive discussion of this topic. Thank you, Henry, and giving it back to you, Johnny and Leo.
Thank you so much.
All right. So we would like to extend our gratitude once more to our audience for actively engaging in the discussion by sharing their questions, to Ms. Rufa for facilitating our Q&A session, and of course to Mr. Henry in aiding the questions of our participants in a clear and profound manner.
Now, let us show our gratitude to our speaker's dedication by presenting the Certificate of Recognition and Appreciation.
Let me read the citation on the certificate. Republic of the Philippines, Philippine State College of Aeronautics, Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Fisher Garden, Pasay City, Philippines. Certificate of Appreciation. This certificate is presented to Henry Emery for his valuable time and expertise as resource speaker for ILAS Talks Season 3, Episode 1, delivering an insightful discussion on the topic Assessing Listening Comprehension in Aeronautical Communication on February 28, 2025 via Zoom. Signed by our Dean, Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Mr. James Albert G. Obispo.
Once again, our research speaker for this event, Mr. Henry Emery. Let's give him a virtual round of applause.